Family is always really important to me, and it's a very intricate series of interconnected relationships that hold everything together. And with so many relationships, there's definitely room for conflict. And I would like to share one with you today between my first cousins and their parents, or my aunt and uncle, that we see that impacts our household family. I would like to start with looking at another part of my family, which are my two dogs. And so my cousins always see our dogs and they've grown up with them and they've loved them. And they always ask their parents for a dog, in which they are always struck down with no. And it's been a constant thing that we see all the time. So, looking at these relationships, we can interpret that using the thinking process would be a logical way to resolve these issues, as outside of manufacturing, in the goal, Goldratt and Cox were able to articulate that this is something that we can actually use when resolving conflict. So what this does is we need to understand basic cause and effect and be able to logically map out our current situation with a current reality tree. In doing so, our primary undesired effect is that the household that they're in no longer has cohesion and flow, and it's not as loving as it should be. So what we can do is we can map out our current symptoms that we see on a surface level and dig further down with the collaboration of my aunt and uncle and cousins, and we can be able to start to identify some of the root causes to this problem of wanting the dog on both sides. So at one level, you can look at this as a basic yes or no. Yes for the dog, no for the dog. Being able to construct the evaporating cloud also needs to understand a little bit more about what we need to change. So the change is probably to get the dog or not, or find some other solution that would be able to achieve a cohesive flow and a happy household. So identifying the common objective, we just already said. And so let's go ahead and do the wanting a dog and the inverse, not getting a dog. Using logic, we can interpret that both of the needs that need to be satisfied to achieve this common goal are there on both sides. The children's need for them to be happy is that they would have a companion that they would be able to play with, and that would also provide them with the unconditional love that would make the kids happy, to where they would then be able to contribute to having a happy household. Looking over at what the parents see, they see getting the dog as a responsibility. And so not getting the dog means that they are relieved of all of these extra chores and extra obligations that the dog would require, as well as the mess. And so being able to rid themselves of that means that the household would be more happy. Now, as extended family that has dogs, there can be some room for bias. And what the thinking process is able to do is it is able to identify this bias and assess validity to eliminate any sort of conflict of interest, which makes it an effective problem-solving tool. The ability to separate fact from opinion is important for the thinking process, as it provides possible solutions and is then able to test them in a future reality tree and a negative branch reservation. And in doing so, it also increases its ability to persuade people that are resistant to any sort of change. Something uncovered from the previous steps is looking at the youngest cousin. They all recently moved to a new neighborhood, and he is now no longer near any of his friends. So he feels much more isolated, as well as suffering the after effects of COVID-19 makes him feel very lonely and sad. Now, looking at the parent's perspective, another thing that's uncovered is the feeling of loss, as the father, or my uncle, was the only one to ever have a dog, and he had the biggest heartbreak whenever he lost him. And so he is scared and hesitant to ever go back and feeling that way, because he knows it's inevitable that it will happen. And so one thing about the thinking process is it's able to identify that there should be a win-win scenario in here, and no one would really have to compromise, as we can dig further down beside the initial resistance of wanting a dog and not wanting a dog, and really understand the true motives to provide a probable solution. One thing that we do understand is that my aunt and uncle love their children very much. And then using the thinking process to dig deeper than just the dog, we were able to identify that the youngest was beginning to feel very lonely and isolated from not having a dog. And they understand that their love for the child will always outweigh any possible heartbreak that a dog might bring later on. And so we can now understand that the injection is to get the dog, but what we need to do is use current reality and then also possibly bring in some new injections to be able to stay away from any undesired effect and just only get the desired effect of a loving household that flows with cohesion. And so one way to do it is, if cleanliness is a concern, get a hypoallergenic dog so there's no shedding to worry about, and that's one less thing that you would have to really clean. Of course, the dog would still need to be washed and brushed, but dog hair coming from an owner of a golden retriever is sometimes a really big concern. Another thing is you could construct a fence. Since they're currently still renovating their house, it would be much more simple for them to be able to install a fence so they wouldn't have to constantly go out with the dog in any sort of weather to let them use the restroom. Uncovering the real root causes of this problem showed that it stemmed more from just getting a dog and not just getting a dog. And we could understand better about both sides and then be able to find an optimal way to achieve a win-win situation where both parties' requirements are met. Application of the theory of constraints and the thinking process allows us to mend our own personal relationships and just shows the overall scope of the theory of constraints, as it is not limited to basic manufacturing principles and can be used in mending our own relationships and relationship management.